In 1929, a torn map fragment recovered from Topkapi Palace bore a 1513 signature and a southern coastline that official history would not place for more than 3 centuries. In 1502, another world map was guarded so closely that it had to be stolen for 12 gold ducats. By 1402, a Korean court map was already tracing Africa with improbable accuracy. The documents survived. The chain that should explain them did not. This file concerns maps that survived more intact than the explanation behind them. The object remains. The date remains. The archive remains. What weakens, case after case, is the route by which the knowledge seems to have arrived. That is the real subject here. Not strange maps, not a catalog of old curiosities, a recurring archival failure. A document enters the record with geographic confidence that appears premature. Its stated sources are missing, disputed, classified, or too thin to carry the weight later attached to them. A narrower explanation is usually available. Copying, distortion, projection error, speculation was later mistaken for precision. Those possibilities remain part of the file. They do not settle it. Because the same pressure point returns across different centuries, courts, and archives. The page survives more clearly than the transmission. The result is more clearly established than the chain of custody behind it. That distinction is where this dossier begins. Not to force a theory, not to turn damaged evidence into certainty, only to examine a pattern the archive preserved more clearly than it explained. Several of these maps entered history with more detail than their surviving source trail should easily allow. The file did not disappear. It thinned. Case 1 opens in the Ottoman archive with a fragment, a date, and a coastline that arrived too early. The Piri Reis fragment. The first file survives as a fragment, not a complete atlas, not even a complete world map, only a damaged section of one chart. It re-entered the archive in 1929 during cataloging work at Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. The material was not paper. It was gazelle skin, rolled, overlooked, then brought back into view. What surfaced on that fragment was enough to open the dossier. A date, 1513, a signature, Piri Reis, an admiral of the Ottoman Navy. The object itself is not in dispute. The surviving section shows part of the Atlantic world. West Africa is there. The eastern coast of South America is there. The Caribbean appears in partial form, and written directly on the map are Piri Reis's own notes about how the chart was made. Those notes are where the file begins to thin. Piri Reis did not present the map as an original act of discovery. He described it as a compilation. According to the text preserved on the fragment, the chart had been assembled from approximately 20 earlier source maps. Some were recent. Some, he claimed, were already old when he received them. One was said to have belonged to Christopher Columbus. Others were described in language that later readers linked to much older traditions, even the age of Alexander. That claim matters, not because it proves ancient global cartography. It does not. It matters because none of those source charts are in the file. The map survives. The source chain does not. That is the first rupture. On its own, it would not be enough. Composite cartography was normal in the early modern world. Charts were copied, merged, corrected, and inherited across languages, ports, courts, and empires. No serious reading of the period can treat compilation as suspicious by default. The pressure comes from one section near the lower edge of the fragment. A southern landmass appears there. Its identity is the entire dispute. Later writers argued that the form should be read as Antarctica. Not the Antarctica of modern coastlines alone, but in some readings, a coastline linked to terrain beneath the ice, particularly the region later associated with Queen Maud Land. That is the famous claim. It is also the point where caution becomes necessary. The conventional explanation is narrower. and it cannot be dismissed. Most historians and cartographic scholars have treated the supposed Antarctic section as a misread extension of South America, a distortion caused by combining incomplete charts, a projection issue, a stitched composite later viewers forced into a pattern they wanted to see. That reading has real weight. The fragment contains errors elsewhere. It is not a precision instrument in every section, and the file gets weaker, not stronger, when those distortions are ignored. Still, the case did not close. Not because the object changed, because the way it was handled changed. By the mid-20th century, the Piri Reis fragment had moved out of ordinary historical discussion and into technical comparison. A 1960 Air Force review entered the record. Later accounts describe the southern portion of the map being compared against seismic survey data gathered during modern Antarctic work. An official letter became part of the file. The map was no longer being discussed only as an Ottoman artifact. It was being treated as a cartographic problem. That shift matters. Once a historical object begins to attract military or technical review, the status of the file changes. Not because that proves the extraordinary claim. It does not. But because the object has crossed a line, it is no longer being handled only as a relic. It is being handled as disputed data. That is a different kind of pressure. In later retellings, the claim grew stronger. The Air Force comparison was said to show a striking correspondence between the southern section of the map and later Antarctic profiles. Some versions added support from technical institutions such as MIT and the U.S. Navy Hydrographic Office. Whether those later interpretations are persuasive is not the point here. The point is that the file hardened around a new question. If the southern form was only a malformed South America, why did later analysts keep treating the section as worth comparing at all? And if the comparisons were overstated, why did the source chain remain so weak at the precise point where confidence became strongest? That is the unresolved pressure in the case. The map's defenders lean heavily on resemblance. Its critics lean heavily on distortion. Neither side can restore the 20 charts Piri Reis said he used. Neither side can reopen the vanished chain of transmission behind the compilation claim. The object remains fixed. The route by which the information reached it does not. That is why the Piri Reis fragment belongs at the front of this dossier. Not because it proves a lost civilization, not because it settles Antarctica. It does neither. It belongs here because the structure of the case is already complete. A dated document survives. Its maker identifies earlier sources. Those sources are missing. A disputed feature attracts far more confidence in later analysis than the surviving provenance can comfortably support. And the file remains open because the archive preserved the result more clearly than it preserved the path that produced it. By 1513, an Ottoman admiral had placed a southern form on a world chart and pointed backward to materials no longer available for inspection. That is enough to establish the anomaly, not a solved anomaly, a recorded one. And once that pattern appears in one file, the question changes. The issue is no longer whether one map looks strange. The issue is whether the same kind of rupture appears again. 18 years later, another map would make that question harder to contain. The Finaeus Antarctica problem. The second file entered the record in Paris. In 1531, Orontius Finaeus published a world map under the Latinized form of his name, Orontius Finaeus. It used a heart-shaped projection. It was deliberate, scholarly. And at the bottom of that design sat the reason the file stayed open. A southern continent drawn not as rumor, but as structure. Mountains, rivers, bays, an interior that looked less like symbolic filler than mapped terrain. That is the first difference from Piri Reis. The earlier case could be confined to one disputed edge of a damaged fragment. This one cannot. Finaeus placed an entire southern landmass into the record. The maker matters here. Finaeus was not a marginal figure later dragged into the story for effect. He was a royal mathematician to Francis I, a professor, a designer of instruments, a man trained to think in coordinates, not legends. The anomaly is simple to state. More than 3 centuries before Antarctica was formally confirmed, Finaeus drew a southern continent with internal features that later readers thought resembled the real one too closely to ignore. Attention settled on the width of the landmass, the placement of mountain systems, the river-like lines descending toward the coast, and indentations later linked to Antarctic geography beneath the ice. The conventional explanation must remain visible. Renaissance scholars had inherited the old idea of terra australis incognita. A southern continent was often treated as a theoretical necessity, a balancing mass, a learned expectation rather than an observed shore. On that reading, Finaeus did not need hidden charts. He needed only the intellectual habits of his century. The mountains could be decorative. The rivers could be imaginative. The whole southern body could be a confident speculation dressed in mathematical style. That explanation carries real weight. It accounts for why a serious scholar might draw a detailed southern continent long before anyone could verify it. It also explains why later readers, already armed with modern maps, might force correspondences that were never intended by the original maker. That caution belongs in the file. But the file did not settle there. By the 20th century, the map was no longer being handled only as a Renaissance curiosity. It had become part of a technical argument. The map, now in the Library of Congress, was pulled into the same comparative atmosphere, gathering around Piri Reis. Researchers such as Charles Hapgood treated Finaeus' southern continent not as an ornament, but as data under dispute. Testimony later cited from Air Force cartographers pushed the same point further. The question was no longer whether 16th century scholars believed in a southern land. It was whether this particular rendering carried too much specific confidence to be dismissed as inherited theory alone. That shift matters. When a historical object starts attracting modern technical comparison, the pressure in the file changes. Not because the extraordinary claim is suddenly proven. It is not. But because the handling shows the object resists easy burial. A speculative southern continent should have remained a footnote. Instead, this one kept being re-examined. That is the pressure point. The source trail behind Finaeus' confidence remains thin. The confidence itself does not. And that is what turns this from one unusual map into a pattern. Piri Reis could still be isolated. A damaged Ottoman compilation, a single disputed coastline. Finaeus makes that containment harder. Different country, different maker, different format. Yet the same region returns, and it returns with more detail, not less. The strongest part of this case is not that it proves Antarctica without ice. The file does not establish that. A second serious document placed a highly formed southern world into the archive, and later handling treated that world as more than a decorative convention. That is enough to raise the temperature of the dossier. Now the question is no longer whether one object was misread. It is whether the record is preserving repeated southern confidence, while preserving too little of the chain that would explain where that confidence came from. The file remains open there, and 18 years later, it would tighten again. Because the next map did not merely imagine Antarctica, it split it, Buache and the Buried Divide. By the third file, the southern anomaly had changed shape. It was no longer only a question of whether Antarctica had been drawn too early. It was a question of whether its internal separation had been drawn too early. In 1737, Philippe Buache presented a polar map in Paris. He was tied to the Academy of Sciences. He served as royal geographer. The object entered the record with institutional standing already attached to it. What Buache placed on the map was more specific than a generalized southern continent. He showed Antarctica divided, not one landmass, two. A channel appeared to run between them, roughly linking the seas on either side of the continent. That is the core anomaly. Not that Buache imagined a southern world. Others had done that already. The pressure here comes from structure, a buried divide, a waterway where later geophysical work would claim one actually lay beneath the ice. The source material behind the claim remained thin. Buache said the map drew on ancient sources and Spanish reports. He did not specify them in a way that the archive can now test. That is the rupture. Again, the object survives more clearly than the transmission chain behind it. The latter confirmation claim is what kept the file active. According to the modern reading preserved in the source material, seismic studies in 1958, followed by later bedrock mapping, pointed to a below sea level connection between the Great Seas on either side of Antarctica. Strip away the ice, the argument goes, and East and West Antarctica would separate into two island-like masses. Buache had drawn that division in 1737, roughly 2 centuries before the buried structure was said to be confirmed. That is the strongest version of the case. It must be handled carefully, because the conventional explanation is available here as well. A scholar in Buache's position could have been speculating from symmetry. He could have extended older theoretical southern maps. He could have been influenced by fragmentary reports from voyages that saw ice, coast, and open water at a distance, then guessed at what lay beyond. None of that is impossible, and none of it should be removed from the file simply because the latter comparison is attractive. But the file does not relax there. Buache was not sketching vague southern complexity. He placed a specific divide in a specific region. That is why this case sharpens the dossier rather than merely repeating it. Piri Reis offered one disputed southern form. Finaeus expanded that form into a full southern continent with internal features. Buache narrows the problem again. Now the anomaly is no longer just premature coastline confidence. It is premature structural confidence under the ice. That shift matters. A broad southern land can be explained away as inheritance. A dividing channel in the right place is harder to reduce to a decorative convention. Not impossible to explain. Harder. That is enough to keep the file open. The handling changed here too. For a long time, Buache's map appears in the record as speculation. Then modern seismic work gives later readers a reason to reopen it. At that point, the map is no longer being read only as an 18th century idea. It is being read as a disputed preview of buried geography. The source chain, however, does not strengthen with that reopening. It weakens further. The more confidence later interpreters place in the buried divide, the more visible the absence behind Buache's own explanation becomes. Ancient sources, Spanish reports, no surviving chain of custody, no complete upstream file. That is why Buache belongs here, not as final proof, as the clearest sign yet that the dossier is tightening. By the third case, the pattern is no longer atmospheric. It has geometry. And once the file begins to preserve missing geography with that level of confidence, the problem is no longer confined to Antarctica alone. It can move north, into a map built around a source text that vanished completely. Mercator's lost northern source. The fourth file moves the pattern north, away from Antarctica, away from buried ice, into a map built around a source the archive no longer possesses. In 1569, Gerardus Mercator published his great world map. Set into it was a separate Arctic design. At its center stood an open polar sea. Around it, 4 channels divided the far north into 4 surrounding lands. At the center of that center sat a black mountain, Rupes Nigra, the black rock. The anomaly here is not only the image, it is the confidence of the image. Mercator was not an obscure compiler drifting at the edge of the record. He was the leading cartographer of his age, the man whose projection would outlive him by centuries. He worked on magnetic declination, compass variation, serious technical problems with navigation. That does not make his Arctic inset correct. It does make casual dismissal less satisfying. What he drew was specific: an ice-free center, a magnetic mountain, a giant whirlpool, 4 symmetrical channels, 4 surrounding land masses. The design is strange enough on its own. What keeps the file open is Mercator's source claim. He did not present the northern scheme as pure invention. He pointed backward to a lost 14th century account called Inventio Fortunata, supposedly written by an English monk after a voyage to the North Pole. That text was known to later scholars. More than one medieval writer referred to it. But every copy vanished. That is the rupture. The map survives. The source it cites does not. Unlike the earlier Antarctic cases, the loss here is explicit. The missing document has a name, a reputation, a place in the scholarly record, but no surviving body. Only Mercator's map appears to preserve the geography that the text described. The conventional explanation appears quickly. It must remain in the file. The 4 rivers can be read as cosmological symbolism. The central mountain can be read as a mythic structure. The whole configuration can be read as medieval sacred geography laid over an unknown region. That interpretation gains force from the imagery itself. Paradisal rivers, perfect symmetry, a magnetic black rock at the top of the world. None of that looks modern. But the file does not end there, because the surrounding coasts complicate the dismissal. Greenland, Iceland, northern Norway. In the source material, these appear more accurate than a wholly symbolic map should comfortably allow. Not perfect, not modern, but informed enough to raise a second question. That split matters. The center looks mythic. The edges look informed. Once a map begins mixing both categories, the burden changes. The question is no longer whether the whole thing is true. It is whether a lost source may have preserved genuine northern data inside a framework that still carried older symbolic language. That is the Mercator problem. Not a clean fraud, not a clean chart, a contaminated file built on a missing text. The handling changed later here as well. 17th through 19th century expeditions found no open sea at the pole, no black mountain, only ice. That should have settled the matter. Instead, modern readers reopened the file after submarine studies described the Arctic basin as a deep central depression ringed by major submarine ridges. Not a confirmation, not even a close one. But enough of an echo to keep the argument alive. That distinction matters. This is not Buache. The latter comparison is weaker, more suggestive than precise. But the archival rupture is stronger. Buache gave the dossier a buried structure beneath ice. Mercator gives it something harder to absorb, a named source that vanished completely. No one can inspect Inventio Fortunata. No one can test Mercator's inheritance against the original text. The missing chain is no longer a probable loss. It is the center of the case. The strongest part of this file is not the Black Mountain, not the whirlpool, not the 4 rivers. It is the combination: a serious technical cartographer, a highly specific Arctic model, a cited source text known to later scholars, and the total disappearance of that text from the surviving record. By the 4th case, the pattern has moved beyond premature geography. Now it includes named upstream evidence that no longer exists. The archive preserves the map. It preserves references to the source. It does not preserve the source itself. And once the file begins to lose named documents, not just unnamed charts, the problem stops looking regional. It starts looking systemic. The next case carries that problem across an ocean, into an empire with no direct presence there, and a map that should not have known the Pacific so well. The Ahmed Pacific Gap. The fifth file leaves the polar world behind. It crosses into the Pacific, and it does so through an empire that should not have had easy access to that ocean. In 1559, an Ottoman world map attributed to a cartographer named Ahmed entered the record. The object is held in the Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul. According to the surviving account, it was brought back into view during the modern study of Ottoman cartography. That is the first stable part of the file. The map exists. Its specific confidence is the problem. What gives this case pressure is not simply age, it is placement. The western coast of the Americas appears on the chart. So do the eastern shores of China and Japan. Pacific islands appear between them. The map has been described as carrying far more coherence in that ocean than the Ottoman context should comfortably allow. That is the rupture. The Ottoman Empire had no Pacific fleet, no documented exploration program in that theater, no direct naval presence anywhere near the waters being drawn. Its maritime power faced west and south. The archive preserves the result. It does not preserve a clean route by which Pacific geographic data entered Ottoman hands. The timing sharpens the problem. Balboa first sighted the Pacific from Panama in 1513. Europeans first crossed it in 1521. Ahmed's map appears in 1559, only decades later. Yet later readers of the file describe the chart as showing coastline relationships that European surveyors themselves had not yet stabilized. California appears in the discussion. So does Baja California. The Pacific Northwest even forms later read as resembling Alaska. On the Asian side, China, Japan, and Southeast Asia are described as appearing with a precision difficult to square with mid-16th century limitations. That is the strong reading. It must be handled carefully, because the conventional explanation remains viable. The Ottoman world was not sealed. Information moved through trade, espionage, interception, copying. Portuguese and Spanish charts were guarded, but not perfectly. Captured sailors could be questioned. Pilot reports could leak. Secret maps could circulate beyond official policy. On that reading, Ahmed did not need impossible knowledge. He needed access. Partial access, perhaps, but enough to build a composite chart from Iberian materials moving through unofficial channels. That explanation has real force. It fits the politics of the period. It fits the value of geographic intelligence. And it avoids mistaking an information leak for a lost civilization. But the file does not settle there, because the same source material that offers espionage as an answer also weakens it. Portuguese and Spanish Pacific charts of the 1550s are described as primitive. Longitude remained unsolved. Even experienced European pilots struggled to position distant coasts correctly in relation to one another. That matters, because once a case depends on leaked charts, those charts have to be good enough to carry the result. The Ahmed file remains open precisely because the implied quality of the upstream material is itself under pressure. This is where the handling changes. The map is no longer just an Ottoman object. It becomes a test of transmission without presence. The empire did not need to sail the Pacific if the data reached it some other way. But if that is the answer, the missing chain becomes the case. Who passed it? From where? In what form? And why no surviving acquisition route explains the result cleanly. Later speculation widened the gap. Some writers pointed toward Chinese maritime exploration as one possible upstream tradition. Others invoked the long Pacific navigation preserved by Polynesian seafarers. The source material even leaves room for more provocative suggestions about fragments of older mapping traditions surviving into Ottoman archives. Those possibilities belong in the file only as possibilities. The surviving record, as presented here, does not establish any of them. That caution matters. The strongest part of the Ahmed case is not the most exotic theory attached to it. It is simpler. a map from 1559 appears to depict Pacific relationships with more assurance than the surviving Ottoman route to that assurance can now explain. That is enough. Not enough to prove a hidden global survey. Enough to keep the dossier open. By this stage, the pattern has widened again. Mercator gave the file a named source that vanished. Ahmed gives it geographic confidence without direct presence. The archive holds the result. The empire's access route remains thin. And once the file begins preserving oceanic knowledge more clearly than the path by which that knowledge arrived, another pressure point comes into view. Not discovery, not theory. Control. Because sometimes the clearest sign that a map carried strategic value is not what it showed. It is what states were willing to do to keep it from moving. The Cantino theft file. The sixth file begins with a theft, not a lost text, not a disputed coastline, a theft. That changes the pressure at once. Because once a state treats a map as contraband, the dossier is no longer dealing only with premature geography. It is dealing with controlled geography. In October 1502, Alberto Cantino, an agent for the Duke of Ferrara, obtained and smuggled out a Portuguese world map. The operation, as preserved in the source material, took place in Lisbon. The chart had been produced by anonymous Portuguese cartographers inside a royal environment built to manage navigational knowledge. Cantino got it out. The object survived. It later entered the Este collection and is now associated with the Biblioteca Estense in Modena. That is the stable part of the file. The unstable part is what the theft implies. Portugal did not guard a map like this for decoration. Routes were strategic. Claims were strategic. Navigation data was strategic. The Cantino Planisphere did not have to prove impossible knowledge to become dangerous. It only had to contain knowledge a crown was unwilling to release. The map is treated in the source material as unusually early in more than one direction. Brazil appears with extensive coastal detail. So do the African coast, the Indian Ocean, India, and parts of the Caribbean. The line of Tordesillas appears as well, dividing the world between Spain and Portugal. This was not just a geographic object. It was a geopolitical one, a chart of possession as much as a chart of place. Brazil is where the file tightens. Cabral's official discovery came in 1500. The Cantino map appears only 2 years later. Yet later readings describe the coastline as extending beyond what the narrow public timeline of exploration should easily support by that date. Portuguese records show only limited southern coastal voyages by 1502. The map records more than the narrow public timeline should easily allow. The same pressure appears in placement. The source material treats the positions of Brazil, Africa, and India as more correct than they should be without later navigational advances. That claim needs caution. Projection distortion can exaggerate apparent accuracy. Retrospective matching can do the same. But the case remains under pressure because the file is not arguing over an obscure manuscript. It is arguing over a map of a maritime state treated as sensitive. The conventional explanation is strong. It belongs in the file. The map can be read as the product of concentrated Portuguese exploration between 1497 and 1502, merged with Spanish Caribbean data and existing Portolan traditions. On that reading, nothing impossible is required. Only an aggressive maritime power gathers intelligence faster than it releases publicly. That explanation has force. It fits the period. It fits the behavior of an empire. But it does not remove the central pressure. Because once the explanation becomes secret state accumulation, a new question takes over. How much more did Portugal know than it admitted? That is the Cantino shift. Earlier cases kept asking whether knowledge arrived too early. This case asks whether knowledge was being withheld on purpose. A missing source chain produces one kind of dossier. A stolen state secret produces another. Here, the anomaly is not just informational. It is behavioral. The handling becomes evidence. The secrecy becomes evidence. The theft becomes evidence. King Manuel's reaction, as later retold in the source material, belongs to that pressure. Its value is procedural, not dramatic. States do not react like that to decorative maps. They react like that to a compromised advantage. Later speculation widened the file. Some readers treated the Cantino Map as proof that Portuguese exploration was more advanced than officially acknowledged. Others pushed further, suggesting older inherited materials behind the chart, or even pre-official knowledge of Brazil. Those possibilities remain unproven. They belong in the record only as attempts to explain a map that looked too complete too early. The strongest part of the Cantino case is simpler. A stolen Portuguese map from 1502 appears to contain strategic geographic knowledge, whose scale and polish strain the narrowest public timeline. That does not prove hidden antiquity. It does prove control, and control changes how the dossier reads. The archive is no longer preserving only anomalies of source and transmission. It is preserving anomalies of release. What was known? What was released? What was delayed? What was worth smuggling out under threat? By the sixth file, the pattern has hardened. Piri Reis gave the dossier with missing charts. Mercator gave it a named source that vanished. Ahmed gave it knowledge without direct presence. Cantino gives it something colder, a state secret that appears more complete than the public record around it. It suggests that early knowledge may have been managed. And once the archive begins to preserve not only strange maps, but the deliberate protection of those maps, the next pressure point comes naturally. Not theft. Revision, because the next map would enter the record early, then return in altered form. Waldseemüller's quiet revision. The seventh file begins with a publication that complicates the discovery instead of settling it. In 1507, Martin Waldseemüller helped issue a world map at Saint-Dié in Lorraine through the Gymnasium Vosges, a scholarly academy. The map was large, 12 woodcut sheets. 1,000 copies were said to have been printed. Only one survived. It was rediscovered in a German castle in 1901 and later purchased by the Library of Congress. The object is not the problem. It is the confidence of its separation and the later retreat from it. This was the first map to use the name America. It was also the first to show the new lands as a separate continent rather than an extension of Asia. But the file tightens around something else. The map appears to show an ocean separating America from Asia. In the source material, that ocean is treated as the Pacific. Balboa would not sight it until 1513. Magellan's expedition would not cross it until 1521. Waldseemüller put that separation into the record in 1507. That is the anomaly, not merely a new continent, a second ocean, a western coastline for South America before Europeans had fully sailed that coast. The map did not just label the world differently, it divided the world differently. The conventional explanation remains available. By 1507, educated scholars knew the Earth was round. Columbus and Vespucci had reached lands increasingly difficult to reconcile with Asia. If those lands formed a separate continent, another ocean beyond them could be inferred. On that reading, Waldseemüller did not need hidden voyages. He needed deduction. The western coast could be conjectured. The ocean could be a theoretical space. The apparent accuracy could be amplified by later readers working backward from modern maps. That explanation has force. It fits the intellectual climate of the period. But the file does not stay there. Waldseemüller did not present the map as a fantasy. The source material places him inside a serious scholarly project. He cited Vespucci and Ptolemy. Neither source supplied a Pacific. Neither source gave him the full western edge of South America. The file, therefore, turns on a narrower question. How far can inference alone account for the confidence of the image? Then the handling changed. In 1513, when Waldseemüller issued a later edition, the map returned in altered form. The name America was removed. The Pacific depiction was modified. That shift is what places this case in the dossier. A premature feature is one kind of anomaly. A later retreat from that feature is another. Once revision enters the record, the object stops looking like a single claim frozen in time. It becomes a file with movement. That movement is the pressure here. The archive preserves the first statement. It preserves the latter adjustment. It does not preserve a final explanation for why the adjustment was made. Retraction may reflect correction. It may reflect second thoughts. It may reflect new information. It may reflect pressure. The surviving file does not settle which. Later readers widened the possibilities. Some suggested undocumented Portuguese or Spanish material behind the 1507 image. Others pointed toward Asian map traditions that may have reached Europe indirectly. Others treated the episode as a warning against overreading a guess. Those possibilities remain open. The record, as preserved here, does not close them. The strongest part of the Waldseemüller case is not that it proves the Pacific was secretly known in 1507. The file does not establish that. Its strongest part is structural. A serious scholarly map entered the record with a continental separation that looked premature. Then part of that confidence was revised. That is enough to keep the dossier under pressure. Cantino raised the question of withheld knowledge. Waldseemüller raises a neighboring one. What happens when early knowledge enters the record, then returns in altered form? By the seventh file, the archive is preserving anomalies of revision. Once a map begins to change in the record, the dossier can no longer ask only what was known. It has to ask what became safer to say later. The next case carries that question outside Europe, into a court map whose accuracy should have depended on sources it should not have possessed so fully. Kangnido and the African outline. The eighth file leaves Europe. By this point, the dossier has already gathered missing charts, vanished texts, secret maps, and quiet revisions inside European records. Kangnido changes the frame. It asks what happens when the same pressure appears in a court far from the Atlantic, the Arctic, and the Portuguese sphere. In 1402, Korean scholars produced a world map now known as Kangnido. The original is lost. 2 15th century copies survive in Japan. The source material names Ryukoku University and Honkoji Temple as the places where those copies remain. The map is linked to royal scholarship and to compilers identified there as Yi Ho and Kwangun. It was built from Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and Islamic knowledge streams. The unstable part is Africa. Nos Kangnido shows the African continent with a shape that the source material treats as unexpectedly early. It stretches north to south with a recognizable taper toward the south. Europe, the Mediterranean, and Arabia appear as well. The pressure comes from relative accuracy. According to the source material, the African form looks better than many European maps drawn long after 1402. That is the anomaly. Not that Korea mapped Africa from direct observation. The file does not claim that. The anomaly is that a Korean court map appears to preserve African geographic confidence from sources its own local record cannot fully expose. That rupture is clear. Korean maritime history, as framed in the source, shows no voyages to Africa, Europe, or the Indian Ocean in this period. Yet the preface to the map states that it was drawn from Chinese, in Japanese and Islamic sources. That explanation belongs in the file. It is the conventional one. Knowledge moved through trade, libraries, scholars, and the Silk Road exchange. On that reading, Kangnido is not impossible. It is a synthesis. A court compilation built far from the coastlines it depicts, but not cut off from the networks that describe them. That explanation has force. But the file does not settle there. because the same source material that offers transmission as an answer presses a harder point. Islamic maps of the period, as described there, do not usually show Africa with this level of proportion. They often render the northern regions well, then widen or distort the southern body. Chinese maps are said to be weaker still on Africa. If that summary is correct, Kangnido is not merely receiving geographic knowledge, may be preserving it in a leaner form than some of the supposed contributing traditions. That is what keeps the case open. Kangnido is no longer only an East Asian court map. It becomes evident that geographic confidence may survive transmission more clearly than the transmission itself survives the archive. The previous file dealt with revision inside a European record. Kangnido widens the dossier by showing that the pressure is not confined to Europe at all. A court map in Korea may preserve Africa better than the traditions it supposedly depended on. That does not prove an ancient global survey. The file does not go that far. It does sharpen a recurring question. When a map looks better than its visible source chain should easily allow, where exactly did the confidence come from? Later speculation widened the possibilities, and some pointed to Roman geographic fragments passing east through long trade networks. Some invoked older reports of African circumnavigation preserved indirectly. Others pushed toward undocumented Chinese maritime knowledge. The source material notes that Zheng Hu's voyages came later, not earlier, which keeps that route from neatly solving the problem. Those possibilities remain unproven. The strongest part of the Kangnido case is simpler. A Korean court map from 1402 appears to preserve an African outline whose confidence exceeds what the surviving local path to that confidence can comfortably explain. That is enough to keep the dossier under pressure. And once the file begins preserving distant geography more clearly than the archive preserves the chain that carried it, the next problem becomes harder to avoid. Not transmission alone. Contamination. Because the next map may contain both real residue and obvious distortion in the same surviving file. The Zeno contamination problem. The ninth file is not clean. By this point, the dossier is no longer asking only whether a map arrived too early, or whether a source vanished, or whether a state controlled what it released. It is asking whether one surviving file can contain both residue and obvious distortion. That is the Zeno problem. In 1558, Niccolò Zeno the Younger published a map and letters he claimed to have found in his family archive. They were said to describe voyages made by his ancestors, Niccolò and Antonio Zeno, to the North Atlantic in the 1390s. If true, the file would place Venetian knowledge in the Northern Ocean a century before Columbus. If false, it would amount to a cartographic fabrication of the 16th century. The map shows Greenland, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and two disputed lands that keep the case active. One is Fryland, placed between Iceland and Greenland. The other is Estata Land, set farther west and sometimes identified by readers with North America. From the beginning, the file was unstable. Some scholars treated it as fraud. Others defended parts of it. Others argued that the file was mixed. Real navigational residue surrounded by invention, family glorification, or later embellishment. That mixed reading is what places this case in the dossier. A complete hoax would close one way. A fully reliable map would close another. The Zeno map resists both endings. Fryland appears nowhere in reality. That matters. A phantom island at the center of the file is not a minor defect. It is contamination. But the source material presses the opposite point at the same time. The depictions of Greenland and Iceland are described as containing accurate features not present in other contemporary European maps. Major cartographers, including Mercator and Ortelius, later incorporated Zeno material into their own work and treated it seriously enough to use. The conventional explanation is strong. It remains the baseline reading. On that view, Nicolo the Younger fabricated the file to elevate family prestige. Fryland is pure invention. The 1390s voyage story is fiction, perhaps inspired by Norse sagas circulating in Europe. The accurate northern details were copied from more recent Portuguese or Danish sources. If later cartographers reuse the material, that only proves that even professionals can absorb bad data when it arrives in convincing form. That explanation has force. It accounts for the Phantom Island. It accounts for the family motive. But the file does not settle there, because some of the residue refuses to behave like a total invention. The Estataland description includes a Western land with a temperate climate, European-style buildings, and Latin books. In the source material, that detail is linked to later archaeological knowledge of Norse settlement in Newfoundland. The question that follows is narrow but difficult. How much of the file is fantasy, and how much may be a distorted memory of a real northern route? That is the contamination problem. Not whether every detail is true, whether a false structure can coexist with authentic transmission. The Zeno family had documented naval status. Venetian trade connections reached England and Northern Europe. That does not prove a Venetian Atlantic voyage in the 1390s. It does make the survival of northern knowledge through indirect contacts harder to dismiss outright. The strongest part of the Zeno case is not Fryland. It is the refusal of the file to simplify. Too inaccurate to trust completely. Too suggestive to discard cleanly. A damaged mixture of invention, borrowed data, and possible Norse residue. By the 9th case, the dossier has reached a colder problem: contaminated evidence. And once a file may contain both fraud and authentic memory at once, the archive stops dividing neatly into true and false. It has to be read for residue. The next case returns to the Mediterranean, to a map that openly cites ancient sources and claims the world was being remembered, not discovered. Fra Mauro and the Memory of Routes. The 10th file returns to the Mediterranean, but it does not close the dossier. It gathers it. By this point, the archive has preserved fragments, vanished texts, secret charts, revisions, and contaminated files. Fra Mauro does something different. His map tries to synthesize the world openly. And in doing so, it preserves one of the clearest statements in the entire record that earlier knowledge may have survived in broken form. Fra Mauro was a Venetian monk and professional cartographer. Around 1450, he completed a vast circular world map. A copy made in 1453 also survives. The source material places the work in Venice and links it to the Portuguese crown through King Afonso V, who wanted the best geographical knowledge available while Portugal was pushing down the African coast. This was not amateur labor. It was workshop cartography made for people who treated routes as policy. Even the map's professional context adds pressure. Portugal was not buying decorations. It was buying navigational advantage. And Fra Mauro was building a document for decision makers, not passive readers of marvels. The map is famous for its south-up orientation. North is not at the top, south is. That feature matters, but not because it proves hidden knowledge by itself. The conventional explanation is simpler. South-up mapping was already familiar in Islamic cartography, and Fra Mauro drew on Islamic material alongside classical and medieval sources. The orientation belongs in the file as evidence of synthesis, not as evidence of mystery on its own. The pressure comes from what the synthesis contains. According to the source material, the map carries accurate Indian Ocean geography, including India, Ceylon, Southeast Asia, and Indonesia, in proportion stronger than a narrow reading of medieval Europe would comfortably expect. More importantly, the African coast extends all the way to the Cape of Good Hope. Official Portuguese credit for rounding the cape belongs to Bartolomeu Dias in 1488. Fra Mauro's map was already placing that reach into the record decades earlier. Then the file tightens further. One annotation describes a European ship sailing around Africa's southern tip in 1420. If taken at face value, that would place a circumnavigation 68 years before DS. The source material treats that note as the most consequential annotation on the map. Fra Mauro did not leave it buried in rumor. He attached it to a work dense with written commentary, reportedly more than 3,000 annotations, and repeatedly referred to ancient sources in the process. That is the rupture. The map survives. The synthesis survives. The claim about older sources survives. What does not survive with equal clarity is the upstream chain. Fra Mauro cites ancient material, Islamic geographers, Marco Polo, and other transmitted authorities. But the file does not preserve a complete route from those cited traditions to every confident geographic decision on the page. The conventional explanation is strong and must remain visible. Venice was a trade hub. Fra Mauro had access to merchants, travelers, texts, and cross-cultural reports that many rivals did not. His map can be read as the high point of medieval synthesis rather than a breach in official history. The 1420 note may be an error, an embellishment, or a reflection of earlier Portuguese activity that surviving records only preserve unevenly. On that reading, the file narrows considerably, but it does not close. Because Fra Mauro makes the dossier's deepest pattern visible in one object. The map is not preserving one anomaly. It is preserving a method. Assemble the world from scattered inheritances, record more than one civilizational viewpoint, and leave behind a result more coherent than the surviving chain of transmission. Now allows historians to reconstruct cleanly. That is why this case belongs at the end of the sequence. By the final file, the earlier pressures have converged. Missing sources, managed knowledge, revision inside the record, inherited geography without a complete surviving chain. Fra Mauro gathers those pressures into a single world image and suggests that Europe may have been remembering roots as much as discovering them. The file does not establish that claim as fact. It does something more useful. It preserves the shape of the problem. A monumental map from around 1450, commissioned in a Portuguese context, drawing on multiple traditions, places the Cape into the record early, cites older authorities repeatedly, and carries a specific note about a voyage around Africa before the official sequence begins. The result survives. The explanation does not survive intact. That is enough. Not to close the file, to leave it open in the most complete form yet. The file does not close with one impossible map. It closes with the same rupture, repeating under different names. A chart survives. The chain behind it thins. A source is cited, then lost. A coastline appears, then outruns the route that should explain it. A state hides what it knows. A later edition retreats from what an earlier one placed on the page. That pattern crosses courts, empires, languages, and centuries. That is the pressure this dossier leaves behind. Not proof of a hidden civilization, not one master archive waiting to be found. The surviving record is weaker than that. But it is also more difficult to dismiss than that. Again and again, the archive preserves the result more clearly than it preserves the transmission. Confidence remains. Provenance thins. Handling changes. The object is compared, protected, revised, or absorbed into later maps, while the route by which the knowledge arrived grows harder to reconstruct. Some files carry missing charts. Some carry vanished texts. Some carry state secrecy. Some carry contamination so severe that invention and residue may sit on the same page. Yet even there, the archive does not become useless. It becomes harder, colder, more procedural. It has to be read for what remains after certainty fails. That imbalance is enough to keep the file open. Not every map in this dossier is right. Not every claim carries the same weight. Some cases may fall under ordinary explanation, Some may dissolve further. But the larger pattern remains. The record repeatedly keeps enough to preserve the anomaly and loses too much to resolve it cleanly. That is why these maps still matter. They do not simply suggest that history once knew more. They suggest that the route by which history knew it was not preserved with equal care. The pages remain. The routes do not. And in this file, the map still looks more complete than the history that surrounds it.